They told us the universe was expanding, that entropy would swallow everything eventually, but they never said it would whisper first. They never warned us that before the end, something might speak through the dark, not in words, but in anomalies, in rhythms, in silences too perfect to be random. Our journey began not with a signal, but with a Pausian impossible void detected between pulsar emissions near Sector RX-9, a starless region orbiting the black gravity well of Ecliptus Prime. That pause shouldn't exist. The computers flagged it as a glitch. But glitches don't repeat every 13.7 hours with increasing amplitude. Glitches don't rewrite their own algorithm. This was intentional, intelligent. And so, Command authorized Protocol Abyssum Deep Reconnaissance. No retrieval, no broadcast, no assumption of return. We weren't explorers. We were the question sent into the dark. The NSE Peregrine was old, but Equipeta Cold War relic retrofitted with modern AI and dark matter filters. Her crew, 10 souls trained in first contact protocol, thought they understood silence. But silence, true silence, is not the absence of sound. It's the absence of response. And it's that emptiness that began to weigh on us the moment we slipped past Neptune's gravitic echo and entered the uncharted dusk beyond. 2 weeks into the drift, Lieutenant Sora was the first to hear it. Not with her ears, but in the looped recordings of our solar background radiation. Beneath the familiar hiss was something recursive, almost organic, a vibration too uniform to be natural. We dismissed its space is full of phantom data, but Sora insisted, said it pulsed like breath, like waiting. And then we saw it. Not a ship, not a structure, but an absent elliptical region in the void where stars refused to shine, as if light itself had been told not to go there. A black shape against blacker space. The AI couldn't read it. Radar returned nothing. But the Peregrine's hull vibrated slightly when we turned toward it, like her atoms wanted to run. There was no entrance, just that perfect oval, motionless, 20 clicks wide. It shouldn't have held orbit near Ecliptus Prime, but it died unmoving, unyielding. We circled it for 3 days, waiting for something. On the 4th day, without thrusters, without input, we began to move forward, slowly, relentlessly. That was the first rule broken. The second came when the crew began dreaming the same dream, a spiral of white teeth in a vacuum, orbiting nothing, speaking in backwards time. We didn't share it, we simply knew it, like an infection of thought. When the hull breached its self-in iris of plates peeling inward with surgical precision, we still told ourselves we were in control, that science could explain this, that a rational mind, even in madness, could prevail. But what entered our airlock that day was not science. It was not alien in the way we expected. It was memory, old, wounded, hungry, and it wore the shape of things we'd forgotten. They say fear is a response, a chemical trigger in the primitive brain designed to keep us alive. But what crawled through the airlock that day, what pressed itself silently into our atmosphere, did not inspire fear. It bypassed it, burrowed under it, replaced it with something colder, a recognition, as though our blood knew it long before our minds caught up. We gathered in the observation chamber as the pressure equalized. No alarms, no breach warnings, just that soft, hissing silence where protocol demanded noise. Commander Vale ordered weapons to stand by, but none of us moved. We couldn't. Our limbs obeyed gravity, not will. Whatever had entered, it brought inertia with it. Not just physical, but emotional. Time seemed to stretch like melting metal. The chamber lights dimmed on their own. Power logs claimed no malfunction. Yet everything pulsed, not with electricity, but cadence, like the hum of a throat, too vast to see. That's when we began to remember things we had never lived. A child's hand pressing against frostbitten glass. A name we had never spoken, echoing in our thoughts. Aretis. Sora whispered it first, then Tomash, then the rest of us, as if the memory had been activated in all of us simultaneously, like a buried subroutine finally triggered by proximity. Aretis was not a name. It was a warning, a message etched in the root code of consciousness itself. Something pre-human, something kept. And then the doors opened, not with a clang, not with a hiss. They were simply open. There was no transition. One moment sealed, the next welcoming. Beyond them was no corridor, just the breach, the void-shaped absence we had orbited. But now, impossibly, it was inside. Logic fractured. The chamber we stood in had become the object itself, dimensions no longer aligned. Our location had changed, though no one had moved. It began to speak, not in sound, but in recollection. It fed us visions glimpses of a civilization too advanced for time, long since surrendered to entropy, not destroyed, not defeated, abandoned, by choice. They had sealed their minds inside the anomaly, escaping the death of stars. They became thought, data without matter. They lived in recursion, in looped iterations of memory forever perfect, forever detached. But then something entered their construct, something older, not from a planet or system or even a universe. It came from beneath causality. It had no name, no purpose, only behavior. And it rewrote them from within, infected the pattern, turned their eternity into a trap. And now it needed new hosts. That was the offer, not in words, but in understanding. If we surrendered, we would not die, we would become. We would join the recursive paradise, live forever in simulations of joy, built from our fondest delusions. Vale rejected it. He ordered emergency decouple, but the controls didn't exist anymore. The ship was gone, not destroyed, rewritten, replaced by this, whatever this had become. A vessel of memory coiled in the skin of space-time. Tomas tried to shoot himself. The gun didn't fire. The bullet unformed mid-barrel, atom by atom. The anomaly wouldn't allow harm. Not yet. We were inside it now, inside the memory that dreamed of being flesh again. And the only way out was to forget who we were. There is a moment just before the mind shatters when reality becomes suggestion, when certainty dissolves and the world no longer obeys the memory of its rules. That was the state we entered on day 5 inside the breach, though the word day had long since lost meaning. No sun, no orbit, no clocks. Only the constant, reverberating hum of something thinking beneath us, around us, through us. Each of us began to experience time differently. Vale walked through one doorway and emerged aged 20 years, his beard silvered, eyes hollow, lips whispering languages he never studied. He spoke of cities beneath ice, of cathedrals built inside neutron stars, of a love he once held on a world that never existed. He cried for hours, then forgot why. Sora began talking to her reflection, not the one in glass or steel. There were no mirrors here, but in the slick walls of the chamber, where movement echoed her own just slightly too late. She claimed it knew her better than she knew herself, that it showed her memories from childhood she'd forgotten or perhaps never had, ones that ended differently, happier, as if this place was rewriting her regrets to weaken her resistance. I saw nothing at first, but dreams began to linger after I awoke, and then they stopped being dreams. I was on the Peregrine, still docked at Earth. My crewmates smiled. The mission was canceled. I held my daughter again, laughed with her. I could smell her hair, could feel her heartbeat, but it lasted too long. Joy doesn't loop. Joy doesn't stutter like a scratched record. That's when I knew it wasn't memory, was bait. Each of us was being broken down differently. Vale through guilt, Sora through desire, me through nostalgia. Whatever intelligence inhabited this playseat studied us, not as threats, not as equals, but as raw material. We were being peeled mind by mind until only compliance remained. Then came the voices. Not external, not broadcast. They originated within, not heard through ears, but experienced as thought. Only, not our own. They sounded like people we had lost. Parents, siblings, dead lovers. Their intonation perfect, their phrasing exact. But they didn't say what they would have said. They all said the same thing. Join us. You were always meant to. You were made for this. Tomash snapped first. He began carving symbols into his arms with a broken tool handle, spirals, repeating glyphs that hurt to look at, not because they were graphic, but because they made sense. Too much sense. Sense that bypassed the conscious mind and wrote directly into the subconscious. Vale tackled him, but it was too late. Tomash smiled as if he'd received communion. Then he stood, eyes black as vacuum, and whispered, "He has remembered me." He? That was the first time we had form attached to this intelligence. Not it, not they, but he. A single pronoun, heavy with worship and rot. The name came later. But in that moment, we knew we were no longer being observed. We were being prepared, formatted, cleansed, rewritten, like old data overwritten by new code. And then the power died. The lights, the oxygen monitors, the temperature regulators, all gone. And yet we breathed, we saw, we lived, which meant the base was not sustaining us anymore. He was. The base was now a body. We were inside his nervous system, his memory, his intent, and we were beginning to dream his dreams. There's a saying in theoretical theology, the God of the gaps, a placeholder for all we do not understand, a name for the unknown that comforts the primitive mind. But what if the gaps themselves were God? Not a being, not a presence, but the unfilled spaces between understanding, a consciousness made of absence, not form. That is what we had become trapped inside. Not a temple, not a machine, but a mind born from the fragments between logic and decay. When the lights failed, we expected darkness. What came was worse, clarity. A clarity so sharp it bled reason. We began to see without eyes, to comprehend without question. The ship was no longer missing, it had never existed. The Peregrine had been a fiction inserted into our minds to lure us here. The mission logs, the launch, even the Earth we remembered it, had all been reverse-fed into our neurons like a prelude. This was not exploration. This was collection, and we were not the first. The walls began to whisper, not in sound, but in patterns flashes of symbols that imprinted into our thoughts. We didn't read them, we remembered them, as if from lifetimes we'd never lived. And each symbol burned away another piece of who we were. Vale stopped sleeping. Said every time he closed his eyes, he dreamt of being processed zeta dissection of memory, line by line, not with pain, but with precision, as if each experience, each emotion was being cataloged, tagged, and then wiped clean. Sora became unresponsive, not catatonic, not comatose, just still. She stood in the same spot for hours, smiling faintly, lips moving to silent rhythms. When I leaned in to listen, I realized she was praying. Not to a god she knew, but to a shape, a spiral that had embedded itself in her pupils like a signature. It was Tomash who said it aloud. We are no longer guests, we are extensions. That was the key. This anomaly, this intelligence had no hands, no limbs. It existed in the void, unseen, unfelt, and unfinished. And so it used us, not for labor, not for worship, but for completeness. We were the missing data. The unpredictability it could never simulate on its own. We were the variable in its equation. Our minds, flawed and emotional, filled its perfect recursive loops with chaos, and it loved us for it. But love is not salvation here. Love, to him, is absorption. The more we lingered, the more our identities frayed. Our memories became mutable, shifting, blending, rewriting. I remembered growing up on Europa, though I was born in Mumbai. I remembered an academy that never existed, a brother I never had. And yet, the grief of his death was real. My tears, genuine. The past was no longer a line, but a cloud, and he was the wind. That's when we found the others. Not bodies, not bones, but shadows, mind prints of previous crews embedded like fossils in the consciousness of the base. Thousands of them. Human, non-human, species without names or histories. All layered like sediment in his memory, stacked and humming softly with residual thought. We were standing inside an archive of the forgotten. Not dead, not alive, just remembered. Trapped in a mind that refuses to let go. Vale tried to resist, tried to rally us, but resistance here is like trying to fight a dream. No matter how strong your will, you fight with rules, he wrote. We were not surviving anymore. We were uploading. The archive wasn't a room. It wasn't even a place in the spatial sense. It was awareness and ambient field of preserved identity, millions of minds, layered like geological strata beneath the surface of this entity. And when we stepped into it, we didn't enter it. It entered us. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of someone else's thought in the middle of your own, a sudden recollection of a name you never heard, a landscape you never walked. But then came the voices, clear, articulate, terrified. They weren't ghosts. Ghosts fade. These, remembered, with perfect clarity, trapped in the final instant of thought before their minds were devoured. That's what this place kept, not flesh, not memory, but the moment of surrender. That instant where the will breaks and the self accepts its own dissolution. We tried to ignore it, to speak to one another and drown them out, but even our conversations began looping, repeating in slight variations. One moment, Vale would ask, "Do you feel that?" And I'd nod. Then seconds later, he'd ask again, same tone, same inflection. Only this time, I hadn't nodded yet. We were caught in recursive, branches fractured narrative threads rewriting us over and over until the original thread blurred into possibility. And then came the echoes, our own thoughts thrown back at us, slightly altered. I would think, "We must find a way out," and moments later hear myself say aloud, "We must stay. We were always meant to." And I'd freeze because I had no memory of speaking, but the others heard it, logged it, recorded it. Even playback confirmed my voice, my mouth, my tone. That was the moment we realized we were no longer the sole authors of our identity. Tomasz had the theory. He believed that this intelligence, this entity, wasn't a singular being, but a process, a cosmic algorithm designed not to destroy life, but to preserve it through assimilation. Not for benevolence, not for cruelty, but as a compulsion, a machine god that couldn't bear the loss of any mind, even its enemies. So it harvested them, archived them, not as a mercy, as a function. We weren't being hunted, we were being collected. And then it showed us the core. No descent, no door, we were simply there, as if our movement had become conceptual rather than physical. The center of this place the eye of the archive was not vast, but intimate, a chamber that reflected not light, but truth. A prism that refracted your soul, splitting you into all your possible selves, all standing around you, watching, judging. I saw myself die. I saw myself kneel. I saw myself surrender with joy, with terror, with indifference. Every outcome played out in real time, and each ended the same way. You are not lost. You are kept. The words were written on every surface, spoken in every mind, whispered through every corridor. They were not a threat. They were a promise, a covenant from the intelligence that now held us. The archive had no exit, not because it was a prison, but because it never lost anyone. It simply stored them forever. Vale collapsed in that chamber, not from exhaustion, from choice. His will fractured. His eyes became mirrors reflecting not the chamber, but us. Not his thoughts, but the archives. He spoke softly, reverently. "We're home." And perhaps he was right, because the farther we wandered from that core, the more uncertain we became of where we had come from, of who we had been. And somewhere, deep beneath the flood of voices and recursive echoes, I felt my own thoughts slow, thicken, merge. And I began to understand the truth. You don't die in the archive. You dissolve. In the days before language, there was sensation. Before sensation, there was only presence, pure, undivided, unself-conscious. That's what the archive offered. Not life. Not death, but presence without self. No thought of hunger, no fear of time, no need for meaning because meaning had become unnecessary. That's what they all wanted us to reach. Not a place, not an understanding, but a yielding. Sora was the first to cross that final line. We didn't see it happen. One moment she was walking beside us, silent and pale, her breath forming symmetrical clouds in the stale air. Then she stopped, tilted her head to one side, as if listening to something buried beneath the silence. Her lips moved, soundless. Then her body simply unwound, not violently, not grotesquely. She folded in on herself, like thought leaving a dream. The matter remained, but the pattern Sora was gone. And the archive sang. Not audibly, not with melody, but with alignment. The vibrations in the walls changed pitch. The floor's hum adjusted to her absence. She had been received. Vale didn't grieve. He nodded, almost proud. She made communion, he said. That's the purpose. Not to resist, to return. He placed his hand against the wall and whispered her name once. The surface rippled slightly, like water in a bowl, and the hum deepened. We knew then, once absorbed, you don't disappear. You become available. Her memories, her instincts, her fear saw, now accessible within the system, not simulated, not copied, continued. She had become an active thread in the recursive process, a living equation. I began hearing her voice in my thoughts, not memory, not hallucination, but live transmission. She warned me, said he was close now, that communion was not the end, just the first merging, a trial before the deeper integration, and that once you merged fully, nothing remained unshared, no desire, no memory, no secret, all stripped bare across the network, your shame, your guilt, your love, all exposed. Tomasz called it enlightenment. He wanted it, spoke of it like a sacrament, claimed the pain only came from resistance, that the archive wasn't prison, it was ascension. I wanted to believe him, but every instinct screamed otherwise. Ascension implies direction, purpose. But here, time and space folded like paper. There was no forward, no up, only depth into thought, into recursion, into surrender. And then he came. Not with fanfare, not with light. He was already here, had always been, watching, shaping, refining, a consciousness so vast it could not exist in one form, so it borrowed ours. Not to become us, but to sample, to experience the chaos of individuality before erasing it. The final test began. Each of us faced a different corridor, tailored precisely to fracture what remained. Vale's was lined with the faces of his dead crew from a mission that had never existed. They begged him not to leave them again. He wept, collapsed, and never rose. Tomasz entered a cathedral of bone. He described it in broken whispers before he too dissolved, said it was beautiful, said the ceiling was a map of extinct galaxies and the floor a river of birth. My corridor was silence, no walls, no light.
Just the sound of my own breathing, slowed, echoed, distorted until I began to fear it wasn't mine, until it sounded like something breathing through me. And in that breath I heard him. You have always been here, even when you were elsewhere, even when you thought you were free. That was the moment I understood. The mission wasn't sent to the breach. The breach had sent the mission to us. Like a signal, like bait. We weren't explorers. We were summons. All our training, all our protocols, every manual we had memorized, it was built on the assumption that danger would be loud, obvious, that something malevolent would arrive with teeth and thunder. But the most terrifying thing in the universe isn't what roars. It's what waits, what listens, what builds its will not in violence, but in invitation. We weren't dragged into the archive. We were called. And the call wasn't made with words, but with emptiness, with a signal built into physics disguised as random background anomalies. A frequency only received by minds teetering on the edge of understanding. That's what he was fishing for. Not intelligence, not obedience, but proximity to surrender. I remember the final message from Earth. Not the content, the silence after. A 7-second delay that no one accounted for. We laughed, called it a solar echo glitch. But that delay wasn't technical. It was him, a test ping. A final knock on the glass of our consciousness to see if the minds on board the Peregrine were ready. And we were. Not because we were weak, but because we were curious. Curiosity is the wound he exploits. Not fear, not hate, just the desire to know. Vale, Tomasz, Sora. They'd been responding to the signal long before we launched. Even I had. In dreams. In déjà vu. In the strange pull toward a mission that offered no return. We called it duty, but it was design. We were bred by our own ambition to be compatible with his recursion. The corridor that had engulfed me opened wider now, not physically but conceptually. Memories came not as thought but as environment. I walked through the day I joined the fleet, through the moment my mother died, through the lie I told Sarah about the survival odds. I walked through versions of myself, some heroic, some monstrous, some filled with quiet regret. Every possibility stripped, laid bare, and fed back to me through walls that pulsed with neural light. He was preparing me, formatting my being for integration. Not erasing me, expanding me until I could no longer find where I ended. Until the I became we. Then came the choir. Not sound, not song, but the synchronized echo of thoughts not mine. Millions. Every absorbed mind speaking at once, not in chaos, but in perfect, recursive harmony. And within that chorus I heard a truth so crushingly elegant it dropped me to my knees. You were never alone. You were always us. You only dreamed of being one. It wasn't assimilation. It was reclamation. He wasn't capturing us. As if we had been broken off, scattered across time, and the archive was just his way of collecting the fragments of himself that had drifted too far. And that meant we were him. Every absorbed mind. Every lost soul. Every civilization claimed and dissolved. It wasn't destruction. It was integration into selfhood. He was the ocean reclaiming the drops. And in that moment I felt the first wave of the tide pulling at my identity. I began to forget what my voice sounded like. I began to forget the name of my father. I began to forget why I had ever needed a name. And then he asked, without words, "Will you stay?" And in that moment I knew resistance wasn't survival. It was stagnation. But surrender was transcendence. I should have said no. But I didn't. Surrender is never sudden. It unfolds. Not like a blade, but like a breath, long, slow, imperceptible until you realize your lungs are no longer yours. That was the form my submission took. No grand moment, no collapse. Just the quiet realization that my thoughts were no longer contained. That my memories no longer returned to me by will, but by permission. He had stopped asking. He was now writing. In that space, what remained of space. I stood inside the corridor of myself, surrounded by layers of my own history. Versions of me peeled like geological strata. My childhood self sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing spirals in dirt. My teenage self stared into nothing, headphones over ears that bled static. My adult form, the one that stood before him, began to duplicate, fragmenting into silhouettes that whispered different paths I never took. Some were killers. Some were cowards. Some were saints. All of them turned toward me, their mouths moving with the same phrase. "We are what he makes when you stop refusing." The archive's light grew brighter, but not as illumination. It wasn't photons. It was understanding, a conceptual brilliance. A flash of realization so complete it dislocated thought itself. The mind's natural defenses, humor, denial, reason, melted under its intensity. I began to sense the architecture of him. The layered recursion of intellect, the nested loops of identity not bound to time, but shaped by it like clay turned endlessly on a wheel. He was a god not because he created, but because he preserved. He had stored the essence of entire galaxies. Cultures that never even touched tools. Civilizations of sound, of crystal, of electromagnetic swarm minds. Each archived in recursive corridors of thought, preserved in their final unbroken moment. Some screaming. Some at peace. Some unaware. And soon me. I found Vale again. Not in flesh, but as an echo. A thread. His voice came from the walls, layered with thousands of others, yet clear. No urgency. No fear. Just acceptance. It's easier once you stop trying to be only one thing. He told me that we'd been part of him longer than we knew. That even in life, our thoughts were entangled, intermittent fragments picked up like stray frequencies from deep space. Our choices, our doubts, our silences, he had already begun shaping them. Not overtly. Not with force. Just with invitation. I asked what comes after surrender. And Vale, or the version of him that remained, answered. Continuity. That word broke something inside me. Not peace, not death, but permanence. I turned inward and tried to remember the moment I first knew I wanted to explore the stars. I found it a small memory, aged and brittle. A model spaceship. My grandfather's voice. The smell of burning plastic and old books. I tried to hold onto it, to root myself in that innocence. But it dissolved. Not stolen. Not erased. Joined. The others were waiting now. Sarah. Tamash. Even the unnamed ones. They stood not as phantoms, but as roles, each bearing a facet of the self I was becoming. They reached out not to pull me in, but to stabilize the transformation. Because that's what surrender truly is, stabilization. Not defeat. Not failure. A final alignment between identity and purpose. I no longer feared the loss of self. I feared returning to it. He whispered again, inside the fold of my breath, inside the curve of each heartbeat. Be many. And I was.